Hello, guys. I got on a very special guest today, Breht O'Shea, host of Revleft, host of Guerrilla History, host of Shoeless in South Dakota. Do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. I'm Breht O'Shea, like you were saying, the host of Revolutionary Left Radio, the former host of Guerrilla History, co-host of the Red Menace podcast as well. And all of those three shows, past and present, kind of come together to formulate my overall output publicly, which is based around political education for the Marxist left, but also anybody else I can reach.
I think I should introduce myself too. I'm a Marxist-Leninist content creator. I started out on TikTok, and I started this podcast because a lot of people are just asking me questions, wanted me to expand on a lot of things, and there's a time limit on TikTok, like 10 minutes. So I just thought, this would be a wonderful way to just teach people about Marxist-Leninism and Marxist-Leninist concepts.
Sweet.
So jumping right into it, how did you first become involved into revolutionary politics, and how did you evolve from anarchism to your specific to Marxism?
Yeah, sure. I think it starts for maybe a lot of us in childhood experiences, born and raised as a member of the working class, living through the lower end, perhaps, of the working class here in South Omaha. Growing up with things just like, your car getting repossessed, your electricity being turned out when you come home from school, seeing your parents struggle even though they work every day. And although I couldn't articulate that into a political ideology at the time, it clearly left an impact on me. And as I grew older, my dad actually, who's passed now, but who, when I would spend time with as a child, he was obsessed with right-wing talk radio in the car. And he often lived in places like Montana or in Kentucky, and we'd often find ourselves in the car for several hours for various reasons, driving across parts of the country, listening to right-wing talk radio. And, Rush Limbaugh, Sean Hannity back in the late 90s, early 2000s. And even when I started working at the age of 15, I worked as a maintenance guy on a golf course to try to bring in some extra money. This is before the era of iPhones and even iPods, and I just had like an old kind of a radio antenna set of headphones that I'd wear as I would mow the greens and whatnot, and I would just have like talk AM radio in my ears all day, and I obviously was influenced by the talk radio part, but I was immediately and sort of instinctually, without even a formal political education, against the ideology and the arguments coming from these figures. And I hadn't even really engaged with or heard from left-wing figures, let alone radical left-wing figures. But just based on my experiences and my sort of budding intellectual curiosity, I just had instinctive sort of rejections of some of their core premises and ideas. And that obviously developed as I developed intellectually. Hip-hop was huge for me, coming across at first underground indie, sort of conscious hip hop, and then even into, albums like Soul Food by Goody Mob and obviously Let's Get Free by Dead Prez. These blew my worldview wide open. They had huge impacts on my intellectual development. And then I got, me and my girlfriend at the time got pregnant when we were 19 years old. And at that point I was working at a gas station. I had dropped out of college. I was just kind of living for the moment, having fun with friends and just getting enough money to get by. But the prospect of having a child sort of like shook me to my core. And I was like, I need to figure out who the fuck I am. I need to figure out life. I need to figure out, things that I can teach this child coming into the world, right? I can't just vibe and hang out with my friends anymore. And I just started reading books literally at random. Like I would just pick up books, start reading them. Anthropology, politics, philosophy, anything that was nonfiction, I just started reading. And all this is a long story, but over time I just became fascinated with learning. I really fell in love with philosophy. I went back to school, got a degree from the state school here in Nebraska in philosophy, and that's when I would come into contact with Marx proper, like philosophical texts in political philosophy class that mentioned Marx or would engage with Marx. And I went to the library and found books on Marx and started reading. And although my shift wasn't directly to Marxism, it kind of went from progressive liberal to DSA during Obama. I was a card-carrying member of the DSA as like a 21 or 22-year-old under the Obama era.
DSA existed back then?
It did. It's an old organization. Yeah, it wasn't.
Oh my God.
It wasn't very popular then. Very few people knew about it, but it did exist, and I somehow found it. So yeah, so all that sort of shifted, and Obama was my big disillusion. I was involved in Occupy, but I still had a little bit of that liberal hope that maybe Obama could turn things around. Right? I was skeptical but open-minded, especially the first term coming out of Bush. In the Bush years, I was anti-war for damn sure. And I had real hope. And then seeing how that term went, seeing the economic crisis of 2008 and how the banks were bailed out, see the rise of drone warfare, U.S. imperialism started becoming very clear to me. And so I realized that not only was liberalism and progressive a dead end, but DSA was not sufficient ideologically to really confront these systems of power and domination. And that shifted me over to revolutionary forms of politics. And we can talk about the shift from Marxism and anarchism and whatnot if you want, but that's kind of my background intellectual development.
Yeah, of course. And of course, I should add, like, I know great comrades in the DSA.
Oh yeah.
Things like that. Yeah, but I'm what I'm fascinated by especially is, of course, you had like sort of like a lived socialist experience, like you were a socialist before you even knew it. But when I listen to like early Breht, right, in the earliest episodes of Revleft, and then modern day Breht, it's almost like two different socialists. Like what exactly was the switch from like anarchism to Marxism in your mind? What made it click?
Yeah, it's a really good question. Yeah, so getting in, I think at the very earliest days of Revleft, I was kind of flirting with Marxism, but wanted to retain an anarchism. I had ideological things to shed from liberalism. I had more learning to do. I had gotten involved in organizing, and a lot of the organizers that I was operating around were, many of them, anarchist. So that was kind of a milieu. And I think when you first get into organizing in a city or something, I think you do kind of, at least back in then. Now I think things are different. But back then, anarchism was much more overrepresented than Marxism. So I kind of fell into that milieu, still had the revolutionary aspects, which I do and obviously continue to be influenced by. But I started shifting as Revleft started. I was Marxist. I was always a fan of Marx, but I was still kind of convinced that Marxism and the way it manifested, I didn't know shit, but I was just sort of like indoctrinated with certain background ideas that I hadn't quite broken free from with regards to that. But I was calling myself a libertarian Marxist in the early days of Revleft, right? Trying to bring on the political economic critique of Marx, but maintain the sort of anti-state anarchism that was kind of easier to digest at that time, but is actually starting the show engaging with Marxists. I remember one of my earliest shows being like, okay, hey, we've covered anarchism a lot. We've covered libertarian Marxism. I've had on a lot of anarchist guests. There's a lot of conflict between anarchists and MLs. Let me have it on MLs, and just be open-minded and hear what they have to say. And they started, throughout that episode and others that I did with Marxists, I started being like, okay. I went from considering like, okay, I'm against capitalism. I'm against imperialism. I know these things. And that's sort of revolutionary politics writ large. But then I started getting interested, okay, what do we do about it? What actually works? What has worked historically? And once I got into those questions, Marxism quickly overcame my anarchism, because then I'm thinking, looking back over history, I start studying history more seriously. Never really been deeply into history before that. But I started getting into history, learning for myself and seeing, whoa, this works, diving deeper into Marxism. And then there was this one book that I came across that isn't particularly amazing book for Marxists, especially if you're a veteran Marxist. It'll seem kind of like obvious and sort of elementary for a Marxist, but it was Why Marx Was Right by Terry Eagleton. And I just came across the book, I picked it up, and what he does in that book is chapter by chapter is he takes myths and lies about Marx and Marxism and deconstructs them in a very accessible way. And that was the straw that broke the camel's back. That showed me like, oh, Marxism, what I've been told about Marxism is bullshit. I'm already interested now in history and strategy. Marxism makes way more sense than anarchism, personally. I have anarchist friends to this day. As you said, great. Even communist Marxists working in the DSA, because a lot of their individual chapters are very autonomous and there's different caucuses. So I didn't mean to shit on DSA. I was talking DSA in the early 2000s is a much different beast than the modern day DSA, to be sure. But that book by Terry Eagleton really broke down the last remaining walls ideologically that I had been conditioned with as an American against Marxism. And then the show, and then studying history, worrying about strategy, organizing more, those all completely dissolved away any hopes that I would ever stay on the anarchist side. And honestly, in those early days, that first 6 to 12 months of Revleft, when that shift happened, that was the biggest disruption in my audience, right? Because a big chunk of my audience had come in for the anarchism stuff. And there was a lot of bitterness, and there was a lot of people that really felt betrayed, and there was a lot of mudslinging, and people turning against me pretty hard, calling me out online, calling me a tanky, all these things. And that's just sort of growing pains, I guess, I had to go through in order to forge forward and create, I think, a new audience. And as Revleft has gone on, not because of Revleft, but just in the background, Marxism among the revolutionary left in the U.S. has really come back, I think, to predominance now. I don't think that anarchism, as it was in the late 90s and early 2000s, the dominant strain of revolutionary politics. I think Marxism, because of many reasons, including the deteriorating conditions and the obviousness of imperialism and just people being able to educate themselves more with the rise of the internet and the information age, Marxism, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think Marxism is now kind of the more predominant serious edge of left-wing organizing and political development amongst the U.S. left right now. So I think that's my history, and I think that's an interesting shift for sure.
I think a lot of what attracted you about Marx is what attracted me about Marx. And also I could hear the comments about the DSA, which is why I mentioned it. It's just like Marx was so good at taking these very complex events that were happening around him in Victorian Europe and able to break them down into their very cell, right? Like this very anarchic, crazy market that was just developing, this new system that was just coming out of its infancy, the industrial age capitalism of his time. And he was able to simplify it. He was able to learn these repeatable trends. And him and Engels were able to develop this framework that, of course, dialectical materialism predates them, but they were able to refine it in a way that would truly serve the liberation of the proletariat in a scientific way. My journey to Marxism is a little bit less having to unlearn propaganda because I was born into a communist family. My parents actually met because both of their cousins were in a communist party in India.
Wow.
That's associated with the Naxals. So I like to say sometimes that I'm literally the birth product of communism, because if they hadn't met, I wouldn't have been born. But one thing I did have to sort of unlearn was Gorbachev era revisionism because I think the collapse of the USSR really affected my family. And it put in a lot of liberalism into their head. So and also my mother, she has ADHD, so she never really read theory. So it was slowly actually interacting with theory, slowly getting over sort of these more social democratic, Gorbachevian trends that had infiltrated into my life through the filter of my family that I actually came to Marxism, Marxist-Leninism specifically. But
yeah, that's fascinating. Absolutely.
Yeah. But I that is what's so wonderful about Marxism. I think it's just this. It's not exactly a religion at all. It's a framework to view the world, and it's so good at just like a scientist is able to break down a molecule into its most basic atoms. I think Marxism does the same thing, and then builds this analysis from there that I don't think other socialist trends are able to do. Would you agree, Brett?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And I think, you mentioned dialectical materialism, and dialectics had obviously been around, millennia in different forms, going back to ancient Greece, going back to Taoism and Buddhism. Like, there's always been a strain of dialectics in human thought, and materialism, obviously emerging post-Enlightenment, had its own sort of, dimensions in philosophy, and it's obviously its rootedness in the development of science. And yeah, it was really the combining of those two that was the real beautiful innovation, and then the articulation of what that actually looks like as applied to class struggle through the lens of historical materialism. So it really was this world historical development that is very much analogous to breakthroughs in the scientific realm. And no matter what version of anti-capitalist politics one has, the one thing that everybody does share is the world historic criticism and critique of capitalist political economy that Marx advanced in Das Kapital. Whether you're an anarchist, whether even you're a social democrat, reformist strands of politics, democratic socialism, and obviously all strains of Marxism, all of them take for granted the critique that Marx himself advanced, even if they, took it in totally different directions, or they betrayed certain other aspects, disregarded historical and dialectical materialism or whatever it may be. So that's always worth saying as well. And then the last thing I wanted to mention is you talked about treating it as a religion, and it's not a religion. I totally agree. Anything can be treated like a religion if, like a religion, we mean like doctrinaire, ossified dogma, right? Even science itself is treated by a lot of modern people as religion, and that it's not engaged with as a living, breathing, developing form of analyzing the world. It's just the conclusion science comes to, I point to as an authority on reality and say that's what I believe. And Marxism, like anything else, can be treated that way. But importantly, if you keep your mind on dialectical materialism as a way of thinking and understand Marxism as a living, breathing, analytic tool that we use to understand the world in motion, then I think you protect yourself from allowing it to become a dead dogma, a mere doctrine, or, as you said, a sort of religious stance, as opposed to a way of analyzing, grappling with the phenomena of the socio-economic and political world.
Absolutely. I mean, Marxism was born out of that split in German ideology with the idealists. And Marx and Engels' greatest critique was that their analysis is not rooted in a concrete analysis of the world. They have these very idealistic phrases. They don't look at history. They don't look at the world around them. And they just come to these words and phrases that are essentially empty and mean nothing. I think Mao Zedong said it best when he said, like, dogmatists are lazy bones. They just treat these facts like they emerge out of a vacuum and apply them lazily everywhere else instead of doing a concrete analysis of the world.
Yes.
With a means to change it. I think that's really what attracts me about Marxism, is it's both so good at critiquing the world, but also so scientifically good at figuring out a plan on how to change it. I think that's something that so much socialist philosophy before Marx and Engels lacked completely. It was good at critiquing the world, perhaps, but it wasn't good at changing it. And of course, Lenin's the one who formulated how to do revolution in a scientific way, but it was truly a kernel of something amazing that has been grown and expanded onto by subsequent revolutionaries, philosophers, things like that.
Absolutely, yeah. Incredibly well said.
So number 2, why is American society, in your opinion, so uniquely anti-worker liberation? Like, even compared to our capitalist counterparts, like Canada, France, Britain, what have you?
I think it's a really, really fascinating question, and I have a lot of thoughts on it. So if I talk too long, you can just break in and tell me to shut up. But I think there's something really interesting in trying to analyze, why is America so uniquely, hyper, insanely capitalist, right? Like, we all know capitalism is the dominant mode of production around the world. It manifests differently in different societies. I don't think it's unfair to say that America represents the most voracious, raw kind of version of it, still untempered, like other forms of capitalism in other countries have been. Maybe you could argue that South Korea, which is very much completely sort of historically intertwined with America, has a similarly voracious form of capitalism. I'm not exactly sure about what institutions they have with regards to a welfare state, etc. But it is also important to note that the welfare states, as they've developed in places like Canada and in places like Western Europe or whatever, are products of Marxism. They come out of the struggle between labor and capital. They are often directly tied back to socialist and communist movements. They're not full-on socialism. They're not what you or I would want to see. But even those ways of tempering capitalism are products of Marxism. And I always like to point out, when the fall of the Soviet Union fell, it removed a brake on capitalism in the West. So the U.S. enters the Reaganite era, the neoliberal era, as the Soviet Union is beginning to crumble. And once it does, the Reaganite neoliberal ideology becomes the bipartisan consensus with Clinton. And this is, among many other things, the dismantling of the New Deal era, which had racial dynamics that were atrocious and plenty of things to critique about that era. But it was precisely the fall of the Soviet Union that took out of the frame the threat, the competition, the other mode of being that allowed, I think, in a lot of ways, for the complete dismantling of even the tepid New Deal. So all of that out of the way, the question still is, why is America so uniquely anti-worker, right? And I think it goes back to the revolution itself, probably before. I mean, just before, the colonists that come over here, especially the English colonists, are Protestants. There's a certain, we can talk about Max Weber's, I believe, Protestant work ethic, the spirit of capitalism, as one piece of this puzzle. But I like to start at the revolution itself. The American Revolution was the most conservative bourgeois revolution, especially the big three, Haiti, France, and the U.S. Haiti is this radical, liberatory, anti-slavery, anti-colonial, anti-imperialist revolution. France is this dramatically left-wing version of a bourgeois revolution. Let's chop off the heads of those with wealth and power. And that still permeates down into the way that the French get mobilized today. And there's obviously been, plenty of interventions by Marxists in French history since then as well. The U.S. was only a revolution in a formal sense, meaning the revolutionary aspect of the American Revolution was just in the formal political structures that ushered in. It was a formal break from constitutional monarchism and into a full-fledged, democratic republic. And so in that sense, sometimes we can say it was historically progressive, in that it was a formal break from all forms of monarchism and the attempt to create a totally new thing, which is a true republic. But that should always be tempered with the fact that this was an incredibly economically conservative reaction. This could be called, if it wasn't for that formal transition to a republic away from a constitutional monarchy, it could be called an aristocratic separatist movement, because it was much more. It did not threaten whatsoever the class makeup of the society it came from. It was a formal political shift, and in fact, all of the founding fathers are incredibly rich. They come from a very specific class. We have early attempts at worker or lower class rebellion, like Shays' Rebellion, that was put down, and these decisive shifts that the U.S. is not going to allow us, that we are not interested in economic egalitarianism whatsoever, right? And so I think that the deeply conservative economic nature of the American Revolution may be, and I could be forgetting some revolutions in history, the most conservative economic revolution of all time. So right from the gate, there's a certain dynamic, a certain rhythm that's at play. Okay, then we move forward. What do we have? We have manifest destiny ideology, open land to allow for the release valve of class struggle, right? The Homestead Act, go to the West. There's land out there. You can build a home, right? These tight cities in Europe that were hyper-industrializing, they don't have huge swaths of territory, an entire continent to push their workers out, to give them more land, right? They don't have that expansionary possibility, so class struggle is concentrated. It has to happen, right? And the U.S. was able to act because of its land that it took over through genocide, and the manifest destiny ideology that came with it, allowed to act as a release valve. Move west, send anybody that's chafing against the situations back east, send them west, right? And then what happens out west? You get a sort of what I would call Wild West libertarianism. You don't have formal structures of law and politics. You certainly don't have millennia of aristocracy and divine rights of kingship that you have over in Europe. You have not only a break from all of that, but you have literally like sort of just a practical break from the Republican structures of government back east. And so you do have this ingrained manifest destiny, Wild West sort of libertarian ideology that forms the core of the American identity very early on top of the already incredibly conservative quote-unquote revolution that we had. Okay, what's the next layer? I've thought about this a lot. Then you have slavery, okay? You have slavery. That's the big crisis, the big thing that was never addressed during the revolution. The framers specifically put it off, kicked the can down the road in order to try to keep the contradictions from blowing this whole project apart at the beginning. It was always destined to be another war. The Civil War was baked into the cake at the founding itself. And you have slave society, which not only jumpstarts the capitalist economy in the U.S., part and parcel with American capitalism is the genocide, clearing territory, the enslavement of Africans, jumpstarting the economy. So these are inseparable from modern American capitalism. And then through the Civil War, you have the end of formal slavery, but segregation, obviously the racism continues to live on, the rise of the KKK, etc. So when you start talking about socialism in France, okay, you're thinking, well, these are my fellow Frenchmen. You have socialism in Denmark, or even the ideas of it. Well, these are, my in-group in some sense. I can see sharing with them more. But now, post-Civil War, you're telling, and all the ideology, all the racism built into the cake, you're saying, okay, socialism also means sharing with them. No way, right? So you have the deep racism at the core of American life. Another slamming fist against the idea of socialism, because real socialism would not only mean their full liberation, it would mean sharing in the resources with them. And we can talk like drained pool politics, right? Even the idea that poor whites would oppose public institutions like a public pool because they had to share it with black people. So what happened in a lot of places throughout the country is after pools were desegregated, right? It's now illegal to say that black people couldn't go certain places. They would just shut down public pools and they'd open up private membership-only clubs. You had to pay money and you had to be accepted in to even use public pools. So then we can just expand that to healthcare, to any other thing where you would have poor whites and who are self-identified in these racist terms that are baked into the core of American identity, and they would rather live lives of more immiseration than they would share a pie that they don't even have a large part of with their black neighbor, right? That was unthinkable. So all of these things are in there. Then you have the Gilded Age, the rise of industrial monopolies, the taking over of government by corrupt forces of the bourgeoisie. The ideology is mounting. And then we enter the Cold War and its ideology. So now, not only do we have all these background conditions in the U.S. that militate against the very premises of socialism, let alone communism, now we have Cold War where to be America, to be an American, is definitionally to be in opposition to socialism, i.e. through the Soviet Union. It's the two blocks, right? We're everything they are, we are not. Everything we are, they are not. So now you're literally and explicitly defining America and American identity as militantly opposed to whatever those Ruskies represent, right? And then you have the cultural shift of the 60s. And for its breaking out of conformity and for the rise of certain movements, you could even talk about black liberation, feminist movements, right? There's plenty of good developments that came out of the 60s, but it was still profoundly individualist. It was always participating in this individualism. So, yeah, sure, it could be a left-wing individualism, but it's reifying individualism as such. And as those boomers grew up, they became the yuppies of the 80s. So that individualism of the hippie countercultural movement, let's move that into the economic realm. Greed is good. Reagan era, get what you can sort of mentality. So that just concretizes it. Clinton comes along, makes it the bipartisan consensus that, neoliberalism is the path that both parties just take for granted. The New Deal has been dismantled in all of its forms. Unions have been dismantled. And then here we are today in the ruins of that 250-year legacy. And we are trying. Now, there's always been movements. There's been communist movements. There's been the Black Panther Party. There's been John Brown. There's been radical abolitionists. There's been indigenous resistance this entire damn time, before America, during America, and up to this very day. Indigenous people are on the front lines combating extractive capitalism, and are fighting for self-determination and autonomy from this settler colonial, dictatorship, this apparatus. So there is that tradition that's always been there, but it's always been repressed by the dominant modes of ideology, and rule and exploitation. And so we now find ourselves in the rubble of that history, right? Trying to continue to pick up and bolster the torch of liberation from the underbelly of this society that's always been there. But we've been cut off from that history on purpose. The main mechanism that working people get power, which is through unions, and the political power that unions represent, have been first de-radicalized through the Red Scare movement and then just de-unionized through the Reagan neoliberal era. And so we are now re-emerging from that rubble in a period of crisis, ecological, economic, spiritual crisis that we find ourselves in, as American capitalism is, in some sense, slamming against the brick wall it's always been headed toward. And now we have a particularly difficult task, but such is our lot, and we have to fight nonetheless. But I think that, and we could go into the nuances of every single thing I just said there, but I think that general trend helps explain a lot about why American society is so particularly hostile to these ideas.
No, absolutely. And as like somebody with a history degree, I think your analysis was wonderful. And I agree with every single aspect of it. I studied Latin American history, and I was always wondering, like, why are Latin Americans so much more, and Central Americans, Mexicans, and why are these workers so much more radical than American workers? Both are, to some extent, settler colonialist countries. And I think it's really, it's the microcosm of a similar society like Israel. I think Israel is very similar to America right now. It's that there's these outside group of settlers who are basically a colonial outpost that are in constant war with the indigenous population, with absolutely no intermarriage, with a very strict caste, with a very strict, not that, Latin American countries didn't have castes either, but America would see like racial segregation to the point where, no intermarriage whatsoever. And I think the watershed moment that highlights this for me is Bacon's Rebellion, where, yes, poor whites and poor blacks and some slaves would get together in order to demand the taking of indigenous land. So it still was races fighting against each other's races. But during this period in early American history, our racial laws were not as codified yet. And free blacks and poor whites would intermarry with each other, right? It wasn't anything radical. Mm-hmm. When the ruling classes of Virginia saw poor whites and free blacks and slaves coming together, it was fucking scary to them. It was terrifying. And so what did you get immediately afterwards? You saw a very concerted effort by the American ruling class to divide the races, right? Put up as many rules and laws against the intermarriage between blacks and whites to make blacks second-class citizens, so on and so forth. I think that really is the crux of it. America is a colonial outpost that achieved what the Nazis couldn't, right? Liebersraum, through its manifest destiny. And this has led to an horribly individualistic culture because it's always been the threat of war. I mean, poor whites, the white populations within the South were vastly outnumbered by the slaves, right? Were vastly outnumbered by the people that they were ruling over. And so they had to, out of fear, bring down the book on them. Out of fear, had to separate themselves from each other. And this little divide and conquer game that America has played has been successful time and time again, and has infiltrated the working movement, the labor movement several times. You mentioned the Gilded Age. During the Gilded Age, there was incredible white chauvinism within the labor movements, right? Even many of our great figures that we look up to, or organizations like the AFL-C, how do you say it? AFL-CIO.
Yep.
CIO, or AFL-CIA. I'm so used to saying that. They were specifically made for skilled white workers, and black workers were not allowed into organizations like that. Gompers, the leader of the AFL-CIO, specifically worked with the U.S. government and white chauvinism. And America was so good at using races to strike break, right? America's Reserve Army of Labor, and I'll just explain that super quick. Marx observed that under capitalism, there's always a section of the population that's unemployed or underemployed so that they can be used to break strikes, and just get negotiating power for the bourgeois. Our Reserve Army of Labor is racialized within America specifically. It's black, it's Hispanic. Before that, it was Eastern European and Slavic migrants, and so it's just this. I wouldn't say wonderful. I would say deviously intelligent game of divide and conquer that you can't really do in, like you said, more unitarian societies like France, though it is slowly getting there within Europe as migrants have been moving there as another Reserve Army of Labor. But it's that America is just a horribly racialized society that never got out of its being a white man with a gun in a vast sea, in a vast forest full of natives, right? Full of indigenous people. That mentality has never left America. And that has led to the most egregious individualism, to the point where, you'll do polling of other countries, right? And British people, French people, these people are not, no offense to British viewers or listeners or French viewers or listeners, but these people are not the most communistic, not the most socialistic. Their super culture is mostly capitalistic, though, welfare. But even they are more than aware, the vast majority of them, of their class status, right? You'll ask a British person, what class are you? I'm working class. I'm middle class, I'm rich, and we can have conversations about how the middle class is not real, especially within a Marxist framework. But if you ask Americans, poll after poll, you just find everybody saying, I'm middle class, I'm middle class, I'm middle class. And then you go to yearly earnings of Americans, and there's no way, this is an actual representation of American society in general. I also think that, like, Americans are under a spell, an ideological spell, because of our racialized society, but also because of the way that we are in the colonial, we're in an insular empire, right? We're in the inside of the empire. All other countries face the brunt of our empire, even if they're our allies, as we're seeing in Ukraine. Even if they're allies and they're not even at war, like Morocco or Egypt are puppets of us, and they face, that second class status and the division of the world and the investment of capital and like exportation of resource, just a classic imperialism. But being within the imperial core in America puts you under an ideological spell that's so hard to break, because it's a different kind of capitalism than being on the receiving end of America's empire, right? It just makes you not. It almost keeps you from being a true materialist, because you are not actually able to analyze capitalism as it materially functions around the entire globe. It puts you into the utmost idealism, and that's what the majority of movements within America are, ideological movements. The Democrats, their idealism is, fascism is happening right now because Trump says mean words. We just need to all hold hands together and sing Kumbaya and just keep on electing the Democrats for 100 fucking years or something. I don't know, 100, 200 years. And then, all our problems will be magically fixed. Republicans, we just got to get rid of migrants, and we got to get rid of LGBTQ rights, and somehow that will translate to like this magical utopia for white workers, because if we get rid of Mexicans or Muslims or something of that sort, somehow capitalists will look at the remaining white workers and just really love them. Like it's an absurd proposition, but the way that American capitalism functions, I think it does put you into that spell within the superstructure that you have to break out of, especially I think the suburbs, which is where the majority of Americans have gone after the 50s, the 60s, in the post-war Reconstruction. The suburbs are just a different version of capitalism that is so different from for example, the DRC, right? In the DRC, you see a capitalism of the utmost barbarity, right? Slaves, children, dying, digging the most precious metals, being used as exploitable digging machines, right? These aren't even human beings. They've turned into fixed capital for like the capitalists, right? The big iPhone companies or smartphone companies. But then, in the suburbs, you get to go to Pilates classes. You can walk your dog down the street. I mean, you got a gated community. A lot of them have security guards. It's a protection against our empire within our empire. And it's almost, of course, the suburbs are tied to white flight, right? Like it is inherently tied to white flight. It is a fortress built inside already a fortress. That colonial, I'm against everybody mentality never fucking stop. That white man with a musket in a sea full of natives in a scary forest, that mentality never fucking stopped. And it continues to this day through the suburbs, through Trumpism. And I think the ultimate conclusion of American ideology and Americanism and everything it stands for is the Trump phenomenon, in addition to the Kamala phenomenon. And both of these are highly individualistic, right? Forget about the genocide in Gaza. You got to think about harm control or damage control. A completely idealistic take that has no material root whatsoever, but it's a product of the way that which America, and especially American liberalism, treats identities, racial, sexual identities, as not based in the material world, but in a vacuum that just sort of come out of nowhere, right? So instead of actually addressing racism, what they'll do is they'll put a black face on the police baton, right? Green, who was our UN representative, was black, and that was an amazing thing for the Biden-Harris administration that we had a black UN representative. And what did she do? She multiple times voted to end the ceasefire, not do the ceasefires within Gaza. She shot down the ceasefires multiple times, led to the deaths of tens of thousands of children, and drew out a horrific conflict. But it was okay because she was black, right? Identity is not actually treated in a material way where, it's a lived experience. It's treated as something in a vacuum. And just by putting blackness on top of the empire, it's okay. So that's that one form of idealism. The other form of idealism is Trumpism, which basically just posits that if I cause as much suffering as possible for gay people, for trans people, for black people through this very thinly veiled DEI initiative bullshit that they're doing, where they're trying to get rid of DEI. It's just a very badly coded way of saying black workers, as far as I can tell. Mexicans, if I can break apart these families, somehow this will materially improve my life. Somehow the capitalists will start caring about me. And what it essentially does is that age-old American thing, which is built into the DNA, where it's like, yeah, my material conditions are getting worse as a poor white cis man, but it's okay because a black person or a gay person is suffering more than me, right? Exactly. Like it's put that, and once you break through that spell, and I have seen them break through the spell, right? We saw that a microcosm of them breaking through that spell with the Luigi Mangione situation, where for the first time, conservatives, liberals, everybody was celebrating an act of class war, but an act of class war from the bottom up. I mean, for the first time, in a long time, America has had, adventurous assassination plots before. This is nothing new, but it was the first time in a long time since, let's say, the Gilded Age or what have you. And the terrorist anarchists of the 1910s, but it was the first time that we had an act of class war bottom up, and what that did, I think, the base of society, right, the economic mode of production, class relations, broke through into the superstructure for just a tiny little bit, and you could see how fucking scared the news media was, how fucking scared Congress people were. I have a friend, Comrade Workwear, and he owns a clothing store, and he was releasing clothing and a card game based on, it was called a CEO hit list card game, right? And it had all the biggest CEOs, and had a little bit funny play, CEOs with targets on them. And when he released that, the NYPD commissioner, in her same statement about Luigi Mangione, brought up the card game. She held it up. She said, people are now making this card game, and it's horrible. This is the worst thing ever. And his business has effectively been shut down. Banks have abandoned his business. It was a small business. It was him relying on himself. Banks have shut him down. His website's been shut down. All of his accounts have been blocked. I mean, they basically purged this very small guy, right, who sold maybe less than 500 shirts a year, right? Not the biggest creator. I don't know his analytics, but he wasn't the biggest fashion brand. He was just one guy working out of his New York apartment making shit. They purged him out of internet reality. They purged him out of everybody's memory because he made a card game with a CEO and a target on his head. And if you want to support him, he is currently trying to fight the New York. He's trying to fight the New York State for what they did. And I can include I'll include his campaign in the description. But what I'm trying to say is, for a second, class consciousness broke through. That divide between black and white and Hispanic and whatever broke through. No longer were Americans, white and undocumented, right? No longer were Americans, white and DEI hires. We were all united against the billionaires, and that was so scary to them that they completely, first of all, tried to push a narrative that Luigi Mangione is the scariest thing ever, and when that didn't work, just suppressed all news about Luigi Mangione. And I think, me and you, Brett, as Marxists and Marxist-Leninists, we know that adventurism is not the best strategy. I think you wouldn't disagree with me there.
Absolutely.
Yeah, but I think Luigi did spark a break in the spell in America's mind control, just temporarily. And that's what's needed to be done. Americans need to break through that spell.
Absolutely. Yeah, there's so much there that I want to touch on and totally agree with you. Let's just start with Luigi. That was the first time in my life, to your point, that I had seen that just explicit falling away of all false division and it just being pure bottom versus the top. So rich people like Ben Shapiro, Sean Hannity, Joanne Reed, whatever the figures on the left are, everybody with a lot of money came out and they said, hey, whoa, this is too far. And then everybody on the bottom, conservative, left, right, whatever you identify as, and you could just see this. I would purposely go to the comment sections of Fox News, to the comment sections of Ben Shapiro's page when he's talking about it. Anytime I saw a right-winger, and I keep my eye on right-wing channels all the time, anytime I would see a right-winger talking about it, I'd see how they talked about it, and I'd see their comments. And it was just the first time in my life where it's just so obviously, as you said, the base broke through and the superstructural fog cleared for a moment. Now, you're right. They try to put the cap on it. They immediately stopped talking about it. It fell out of the news. Part of that is just the news cycle goes on, but part of it is certainly we can't convince the rabble that this is bad. And every time we talk about it, just more and more of them are getting amped up and saying that they agree with it 100%. But here's the problem. The trial is happening. So the mainstream media is definitely going to try to downplay it, but at the same time, talking about it gets a lot of clicks and attention. So there's going to be this contradiction between profit and like the general interests of the ruling class that profits from this stuff. But the trial is going to be really interesting because as far as I'm concerned, as far as I'm aware, he's pleading not guilty. So that means a prolonged trial in the public sphere that is going to really challenge their ability to simply move on. Had he died, had he just pled guilty and there not being a trial, then they could have tried their best to continue to ignore it. The trial is going to bring that to some tension and some contradiction. So we'll see what happens there. And yeah, they all reacted very differently. And one of the big reactions is you start seeing Elon running around with his kid everywhere. Like you've never seen Elon as an engaged fucking parent. Only thing I hear about him talking about is like his trans kid who he hates and feels like the woke mob got to. You never see him and he's not in any sense a present father in the lives of his kids. But after Luigi, you can't see Elon without his kids. And I thought that was just really revealing of the psychodynamics of the sociopath Elon for sure, and his narcissism and self-concern. But the bigger point that you're making, I mean, you make a great point about the living in the belly of the beast and being separated from the actual violence of the rest of the world and the violence of the U.S. empire, creating an insular, hyper-idealist U.S. population on the liberal, quote-unquote, left. I call it the liberal center and the reactionary right. DEI is the newest form of woke. Before that, it was CRT. They've been trying for a long time to basically say the N-word without saying the N-word. And Trump has been able to make that succeed and satiate the long-standing ideological thing with white workers and poor white people. At least I'm not them. They're the real enemies. It's the poor immigrants with no money and power and the DEI people getting jobs that I should. It's not the capitalist. It's not the ruling class. It is these people that are the problem. That is the lifeblood of American ideology that keeps this fucking system going and prevents class unity in any sense. And the liberals, they have inverted the way that we all know reactionaries use race to divide the working class and always have, right? Liberals have inverted that in the modern and postmodern era by reifying, as you were saying, identity politics and, importantly, alienating it from class, which is the mechanism by which people of genuinely different identities and experiences can come together in solidarity. So the liberal movement was to say it's grotesque the way the Republicans and the right use race. They're all racist. They're all bigots. They're all homophobes. That's all true. What we're going to do is we're going to elevate identity, but make goddamn sure that not only do we separate it from class and certainly internationalism, right? Like Muslim identity is great unless you're Palestinian. So it's very insular in that way. And then it's alienated from class, which is the only mechanism of material shared interest where people can come together despite different identities. And then it's actually weaponized against class and anti-imperialist politics. So we saw it really reach its pinnacle in the Hillary campaign where it was Bernie bros and Obama boys, right? Like, and Obama boys was a little different. He, in his first run, a lot of people are young. He was talking about class a lot. He was talking about, I'm going to wear my tennis shoes. I'll join you on the picket line, right? He presented himself in that first campaign as like, I'm anti-war and I'm pro-working class. All bullshit. But with Bernie, he was coming with a more explicit economic populist message. And it was the liberal center that weaponized immediately identity against that movement, claiming that class-focused movement was inherently misogynistic and didn't care enough about identity. And so we've seen that happen, and the dead end that is for sure. But that's the that's the American history long strategy. And any time there's been multiracial coalitions brought together by class interests, the U.S. state has freaked the fuck out and clamped down. You were talking about the Gilded Age and the racism of the unions, and it was the IWW that, in its early days, opened up its membership to black workers, right? And it was immediately in late 1919s, early 1920s where you had basically a pre-COINTEL program go dismantle the organization, put them on trial for sedition or whatever, these false pretenses they use, and destroy the IWW. When Martin Luther King Jr. was talking about the Poor People's Campaign, right? He was going from a civil rights activist to let's criticize Vietnam and let's bring in a multiracial working class element and march on Washington. That was a step too far. Malcolm X was actually fine for the establishment as long as he was saying really inflammatory things about, white devils and the Nation of Islam. He actually, while he was galvanizing and militarizing in some sense the black community, he was still safe from the ruling class's perspective because it was so scary to white people that was something that actually they could use to their benefit to some extent with regards to maintaining and maintenance around white identity and white fear. But when Malcolm X comes back from his sort of religious and spiritual expeditions around the world, comes back from his trip to Mecca and talks about seeing people of all different colors, shared around their shared Islamic faith and started moving in that direction, he now became a threat. Fred Hampton, a threat, operating and talking exactly these things, like black liberation leader, a messianic figure, as the FBI called him, and was doing stuff like the Rainbow Coalition, saying we're not going to fight racism with racism, we're going to fight it with solidarity. He had to be eliminated. And the Black Lives Matter movement in 2020, before it was fully co-opted by the Democrats and opportunists and careerists, right? It scared the ruling class. I remember, because it was a multiracial young movement, it wasn't explicitly around class, but it had the prerequisites of multiracial unity that could very easily, and left-wing multiracial unity that could very easily be leveraged in to a class movement as well as a mechanism by which they could all come together. And there was moments during 2020 where burning down police precincts in Minneapolis with 60% support among the general population, rattling the gates outside the White House until they had to shut all the lights off in the White House, and Trump had to go hide in his underground bunker because there was real concern for about an hour or two that those fences were coming down and we were going to do a real January 6th multiracial movement coming into the White House. So it was really touch and go. And the whole project since then has been this attempt to fight against that with reactionary backlash, now taking the form of anti-DEI, but having all these manifestations since then, which is about reasserting that white racial identity, scapegoating racial minorities, Muslims, immigrants, black people, jacking up the racism, getting behind the Trump movement, talking about white identitarianism. That has been the focus of the reactionary right since 2020, precisely because it touched the oven of multiracial unity. And whenever a movement or a group or a single person touches the oven of getting too damn close to multiracial class unity, the whole system goes into overdrive. The right, through reactionary white reification of identity, is separate from them, and the liberal movement in reifying identity, but using it as a wedge against class. So actually, you don't have anything to share with a white person or a cis white man. He is your enemy by virtue of his inborn characteristics of being a white cis man. He could never understand. You have nothing in common with him. He should sit down and shut up. And that's a way that they actually take that age-old practice and invert it for the same exact ends. And so as Marxists, as people who are interested very much in a multiracial, internationalist, socialist revolution, we have to see how that manifests in both arms of the ruling class and combat it the entire time.
Absolutely. I think during the ongoing, it's still an ongoing genocide in Gaza, but during the genocide in Gaza, that was employed in liberal politics, just what you said, like you have nothing in common with a white man. Things like, are Palestinians anti-black would
Exactly.
like conversations like these would come up, and it's not based in any material reality, right? It's a complete abstraction of these real world issues, but it's just how it's a form of American left idealism, I think. I also think really what the Western working class has lost with the collapse of the USSR specifically, even if it was a revisionist state after the death of Stalin, and especially in the Gorbachev era, what the world lost was class struggle being at the forefront, right? Tony Blair, the labor leader, he would say that we now live in a post-class society, right? Like, hey, the class struggle is gone. We're at the end of history. And slowly but surely, the world has been gaining back, right? The working movements have been gaining back our class consciousness. And we were seeing that in BLM, right? They would write articles supporting Cuba, right? They would write articles supporting Cuba against sanctions. They were very close to it. And of course, they got enveloped. I think it's the difficulty of spontaneity, right? You know, Lenin analyzed this beautifully, that without a vanguard party leading the working class, and that doesn't mean we're separated from the masses. That doesn't mean we hate the masses. That doesn't mean we're dictatorial over the masses. But a working class without a vanguard party, without it leading the working class always gets into these spontaneous movements that fizzle out, that become reformist, that become incorporated into the state machinery. And that's exactly what happened with BLM. That's exactly what happened with Occupy. That's exactly what happened with so many movements. Pivoting this conversation just
really quick,
slightly.
Really quick, before you move on, I'm sorry, I just want to make one point based on what you said. Despite the limits of spontaneity and the fact that a movement like BLM was ultimately, in some sense, it fizzled out, was co-opted by the Democratic Party, the careerist, opportunist, all that stuff. What it did do, as well as what Palestine is doing right now, is it is inexorably raising consciousness. So after Black Lives Matter, you saw, and during Black Lives Matter, a flood of reinterest in figures like Fred Hampton, a flood of reinterest in the Black Panther Party. Sometimes it took more liberal forms, sometimes it took more radical forms, but these instances, and then with the now ongoing genocide in Palestine, the connections that go back to Black liberation movements, every major Black revolutionary figure in the U.S. has talked about and identified with the Palestinian struggle. These moments, although they do come and eventually they go, and it can sometimes feel like, damn, we were defeated again, they are every single time rising the tide of consciousness, especially among young people who are encountering these ideas and this history for the first time through these movements. And so there is a building on top of each other that is occurring, going all the way back to Occupy and beyond. There's momentum, and although these movements, and Standing Rock, right, although these movements come and go, they build on one another, they educate the next generation, and they create more organization. And so in and of themselves, they do contribute that. And that is why the movement on the left has been gaining steam. It's a very uphill battle, but every iteration of struggle raises the consciousness, convinces more people, and at the same time, in the background, capitalism itself is decaying, is failing to meet the needs of more and more people, throwing more and more people into precarity. And so those two things are feeding off of each other. And that really does give me optimism and hope that we are entering a period of intense unmasking and intense struggle. And our job is not to get black-pilled and doomerish because, things are looking so scary right now, but realizing that because the system is getting desperate, because it is in a moment of crisis, and it is overreacting and overextending itself out of desperation, out of weakness, and that means opportunities for us dialectically.
Yeah, of course. No. I mean, that nuance is so important. And, I mean, communist leaders themselves recognize all of this. I mean, Stalin, in the Foundations of Leninism, he mentioned that the closer and closer you get to a revolutionary outburst, the more of these tiny little movements you get, right? Like these tiny little big movements, these big ruptures that slowly train the working class for that final triumphant win, that final triumphant push over that climax of revolution. And it's important not to do that push too before the climax, where you're going way too far ahead of the masses' revolutionary potential, or too far behind where you're tailing them. But I think we are witnessing those like smaller bursts that are getting more and more frequent. And Gaza has really just exemplified that to an extreme. It's been a worldwide movement that has come in like a whirlwind, and the Palestinian people, in liberating themselves, I think, have to some extent started a really big ball of liberation for so many other events, right?
Absolutely.
It's led to so much anti-capitalism. It's led to so much anti-Westernism, anti-imperialism into the mainstream globally. You know, in the most poorest countries, you know, in the most poorest African countries, you know, my friends in the CPK, the Communist Party of Kenya, will hold up Palestinian flags and talk about how much they love Palestine. Booker Amole, a great comrade, he will do that. And then all the way from you know, America or Canada, they'll hold up the Palestinian flag. I mean, it's broken down so many. It started the ball on Black liberation, worker liberation, colonial liberation. I mean, it's I have to thank the Palestinian people who always stay in my heart because of that. Moving the conversation a little, one observation that one of my friends pointed out, actually, Henri Martel, a very well-read guy who writes articles, is that Western fascism, as it currently is operating, this new sort of fascism that we're getting, is very different from the old kinds of fascism, and even fascisms in Asia, like with the Modi and the BJP, which is where old kind of fascisms were sort of like, in how communism is an inversion of the inversion, right? It's an inversion of the capitalist productive forces to a primitive communist social relation. Fascism was an inversion historically, and even within like the BJP, of socialism. It was an inversion of socialist structures. It was, forget about the class struggle, but we're going to keep a lot of the institutions of socialist parties, socialist aesthetics, and socialist working class movements. And we'll even brand ourselves as socialists, you know, the Italians and the Germans. So like, you know, for example, Mussolini would have these relaxing houses for workers, right? And after a long, hard shift at your job, you could go there and you could relax and chill with other people as long as you were anti-communist, right? That was the one caveat, right? You got to be anti-communist. And similar things, the BJP in India will meet people's economic needs a little bit. It'll go to a village, it'll invest a little bit in order to get support for maintaining bourgeois rule. But within Western societies, as we're seeing fascism rise, it's very individualistic. I don't see that social welfare, that social welfare base whatsoever. In fact, it seems to be alienating itself from its own base in the form of Trump, as he gets rid of benefits, social welfare benefits for veterans, for his own base, SNAP programs, social welfare. There's no Republican cadres, like fascist cadres going from city to city asking you what you need. Please support the bourgeois and forget about the class struggle. It's very separated. Why do you think that this new kind of fascism that we're seeing in the West is so individualistic? Is it because the bourgeois don't have anything to give up anymore?
I think that's a huge part of it. Yeah, the bourgeois don't have anything to give up. The post-war period in the U.S., for example, right? Sometimes there's like democratic socialists and social democrats in the U.S. that say we need to bring back the New. Even Bernie talks in these languages, you know. We need to bring back the New Deal. What they don't understand, the material basis for the New Deal is gone. That was a unique moment in capitalist history where the pie was growing and it could be shared in very certain economic context. The rise of the U.S. as the military and economic superpower in the world. You know, Europe is in ruins. You have the globalization process then occurring where you know, Western investment can continue to fly more voraciously into different corners of the world, open up new markets. That's coming to an end, that whole process. And the material basis is now obliterated for something like returning to the New Deal. The contradictions are so deep that capitalism can actually only be transcended now. There is no real way to continue to reform it. And then you have the ideology in the background. So American fascism, for example, is deeply imbued with all the ideology that we just talked about earlier, the corporate, neoliberal, hyper-individualistic, capitalist forms of thinking and being. And when you have a figure like Trump who is completely conditioned and the Republican Party in general, of these older people who are completely conditioned by these periods that they lived in and the ideologies of their time, they are not thinking in those terms. And on top of that, you add the neoliberal period has actually dismantled democratic mechanisms, right? It has been about privatizing social function. It has been about protecting capital from democratic pushback. It's been about co-opting both, in the U.S. especially, and around the Western world, and the U.K. is very similar, co-opting both parties through the influence of big money, such that you don't have to rely on not only democratic mechanisms as much, but on mass movements as much. You talked about Germany and Italian fascism, right? Both of which relied, as you were talking, the inversion of socialism, which socialism completely relies on mass movements. Both of them relied on that structure of mobilizing the masses to some extent and having that mass support. And if we still had anything like a reasonably democratic society, even under capitalist conditions, maybe they would have to appeal in that direction. But neoliberalism has whittled all of that away. There is no organized labor, right? There was organized labor in those earlier iterations of fascism that needed to be contended with as a political force. We saw the SA under the Nazis, and of course Mussolini, as you were just talking about, and the Italian communist movement, but the Italian working class movement, unionization movement. All of those things don't apply in places like the U.S. and even the U.K., right? So the whole need to move in that direction, the practicality of engaging with those forces just simply isn't there. And then you add on, of course, on top the fact that honestly they can't do it, and the fact that there's this ideological sort of program running in the background, especially in the US and UK, that is hyper individualist, and also just very stupid. I mean, because there's a point at which you think, if I am a capitalist, if I am incredibly wealthy and powerful in American society, and I see this whole fucking society coming apart at the seams, isn't it actually smart to try as much as we can to satiate at least some strata of the working class, win them over through economic reforms, calm down some of the internal contradictions and class tensions in our society so that we can perpetuate the system that I am so clearly benefiting from? And yeah, if that means instead of me being worth $400 billion, I'm worth $200 billion, I'm still a 100 billionaire, and I still have insane access to power and wealth and any fucking thing that I want ever. So, but that is too strategic. That is too long-term planning for the capitalist mode of production and the economic elite, who think quarter by quarter, who think about maximizing profits today. And so it's this funny irony I like to point out, that if you want to perpetuate American capitalism and basically keep the structure of American capitalism, imperialism in place, you could best do, over the medium and long term, you could best do that through a social democratic Bernie-like movement, right? Which doesn't challenge imperialism. It doesn't actually challenge class society. It just says, let's share the pie a little bit. And you can even give it a conservative inflection that's anti-immigrant. And if we're going to share the pie, we just got to share it amongst ourselves, kick the immigrants out, right? You could still do all of this movement within that movement to kind of perpetuate the system long term. But it's literally, American capitalism in particular, literally incapable of that. It literally can't think in those terms. Certainly a leader like Trump does not think in those terms whatsoever. And so all that's left to do, stomp the death drive accelerationist gas pedal and rip open the fucking carcass of American life, slash taxes on the rich even more, hand over government power literally to the oligarchy, dismantle Medicaid, dismantle any fucking fragments and tattered pieces of the social safety net that may still remain, and hit the goddamn gas pedal. And maybe in the minds of techno-libertarian freaks on ketamine in Silicon Valley, they think if they do this quick enough, that maybe they can totally dismantle democracy, They can usher in techno-feudalism, and with their techno-utopian ideas that AI just in 5 years is going to be able to eliminate every job and concretize their power, and use the Israeli model to use hypertech to box in and cage an exploited and dominated population, and then we can retreat to our bunkers, and we can have private police, and we can retreat to our gated communities with private police. Maybe we can do that in quick enough time before the rabble catches on and does anything about it. And so I don't know if that's a conscious thought or an unconscious death drive in the American ruling class elite, but we've long passed the turnpike for going in a more sustainable long-term direction through social democracy and concession giving. Now we're hitting the pedal on our death drive and seeing what the fuck happens. So yeah, there's a certain insanity about it. And we are living at this insane period in American history and world history where the capitalism is just hitting its limits. It's infiltrated markets around the world. It's enjoyed, 100 years of imperial hegemonic Western domination. It's reaching its ecological limits. It's becoming more and more irrational. Its ideological superstructures failing to convince more and more people as the material base falls out from underneath. Regular working people are what in America used to be called the quote-unquote mystical obscurantism middle class. That doesn't exist anymore. People cling to the verbiage of it and the self-identity of it. It doesn't really exist. There's a upper professional class, and there's a big bourgeoisie, and there's a huge underclass. And that underclass has strata, but there is no middle class to be spoken of. So yeah, I think it's accelerationism. I think it's hubris. I actually don't think it'll work. I think, the empire is in retreat, and so it's lashing out. Domestic capitalism is failing, and so it's lashing out. It doesn't have the long-term capability to plan and strategize and do anything in a way that will keep it going in the long term. And so it's going to go down in flames. It's going to try to do fascism, techno-fortified fascism, and it's going to hope that it can pull that off in time before we catch on and organize enough to do anything about it. And so that's our challenge. Will we rise to it or not? It really is socialism or barbarism.
Right. I'm going to be completely honest. I think Trump is a fucking secret Chinese spy. I mean, the way he's taking down the American empire. I mean,
so poetic.
If I was a communist and president and I wanted to destroy America from within, I think I would do what Trump is doing right now to some extent. Like, I mean, okay, look, here's what I'll say. Okay, I think to some extent, and this is a non-Marxist thing to say, but I think to some extent, America's rulers started believing in their own bullshit, right? Like, there used to be a separation where they understood what they were telling the public and what they were talking to each other in smoke-filled rooms was completely different, right? And somewhere along that line of fail sons in power, they just ended up with Nepo babies holding the reins of government who have no idea how to drive this fucking ship. And it is all the contradictions of imperialism, state monopoly capitalism, right? As Lenin said, state monopoly capitalism is sort of moribund capitalism. It's the final, because these large monopolies, they eat away at a society completely, right? Even the historically somewhat progressive roles of capitalism get eaten away in this new stage. And instead of promoting innovation, they temper innovation, right? Through their monopolization, copyrights, taking down of other, even companies, So within capitalist logic, it doesn't even work anymore. They eat away at society through taking all these resources, right? Our tax dollars start going towards their need for gluts to be invested into the military sector, for the capital to keep on reproducing itself. So our healthcare gets taken away and put into this military sector. Our schools get put away and put into this military sector. And even though we have entered into an era where we produce more than enough for humanity to never go hungry again, right? We produce at the most basic level more than enough kilocalories to feed the majority of humanity. We have more than enough homes to house all the homeless people in America. The productive forces, there's no issue with it, but the relations of production start butting heads. And it's amazing how capitalism has had a tendency to survive. It's been amazingly elastic at going through big crises, right? Marx and Engels predicted big crises in Europe and this sort of a world revolution starting in the most Western developed nations. And, history and the era of imperialism has sort of changed that. But capitalism has shown an amazing elasticity where every time historically communists have thought, this is it, right? The great World War I, this is it. This is world revolution, as Lenin and so many communists at the time thought before World War I ended. The Great Depression, this is it. This is the end for capitalism, as the Comintern and the USSR, many inner circles in the USSR thought. World War II, this is it. The 60s, this is it, right? America's empire is on collapse. The Vietnamese are putting up an amazing fucking fight. They're losing in Latin America. It's not looking good for the American empire. Capitalism has shown an amazing ability to rebound in this elasticity. However, it's only been able to take the hits for so long, right? Like, it's only been able to, and every single time it's had these hits, it's gotten a little bit weaker and weaker and weaker. I mean, we are living right now in the post 2008 financial crash world in a very moribund capitalism. Like, if the capitalism of Lenin's time was a moribund capitalism, we are in a zombie, right? Exactly. We are in something that should have died a long fucking time ago.
Yes.
And it's as it keeps on trucking along, the people at the helm of the empire don't know what the fuck they're doing anymore, right? It's almost like watching the Roman Empire go from a statesman who knew what they were doing, like Caesar or Alexander the Great, to Romulus, right? Like these bumbling guys who have no idea what the fuck is going on. These fail sons put in there by meritocracy. And I think Trump, Doge, Elon Musk is the perfect exemplar of this. They literally fired accidentally people in charge of America's nuclear missiles. They've stopped funding for the treacherous Palestinian Authority,
or the US AD and NED,
US aid, NED, right? These are institutions of American imperialism, and now conservatives are looking at me in my comment section telling me you leftists must be funded by US aid, right? I want to literally reach through my phone and slap these people. Like, you were helping me out accidentally to some extent. Like, you're destroying the American empire, but through the language of strengthening it. I mean,
yes,
it's eating itself. It's eating itself. It's just nowhere left. This elasticity is less elastic. It's getting, like a rubber band. You stretch it 100 times, and slowly but slowly, those micro tears end up on it. And again and again, Great Depression, World War I, World War II, Vietnam War, whatever. And it's so close to snapping. I can't predict when it's going to snap. Like many communists before, I'm hopeful that it will snap soon, but I don't really see it. But it is getting close. And I think the people stretching out that elastic band as far as they can is Trump and Elon Musk right now. They are just ripping it, trying to see how far they can stretch this elastic band and not snap it. Brett, if you have any thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, so well said, very funny, deeply insightful. Yeah, that's what I mean by accelerationism. They're stretching it further, thinking that they're doing something to fix the Band-Aid or to fix the rubber band, and it's going to snap. When it'll snap, how it'll snap, I don't know. And although it's inevitable, and although it has to happen, it could be incredibly fucking dark times. I think it's going to get worse before it gets better. And the ways that it snaps is going to be something like complete economic collapse that makes the Great Depression look, nice by comparison. It's going to be World War III. It's going to be environmental catastrophes piling up. Who knows exactly how it's going to happen? I mean, at some point, you'd think that the rest of the world, if they sober up, they have to come together and put down the rabid dog. Because America still has the biggest economy, or China now is in competition, but still has the biggest and strongest military. So what does a dying society with the biggest and most powerful and technologically advanced military in human history, how does that dog die? And that's still a huge question to be answered. Now, your point about forces versus relations of production is spot on, goes back to Marx and Engels, talking about this contradiction that you're right. The stupidities of the system is that we can live within ecological limits. We can have enough resources to feed and house everybody. We can do this, but the relations of production won't allow for it. And it's that contradiction that mounts over time in the beating heart of capitalism, like a artery to the heart being filled up with plaque. It will eventually stop working. It will seize up and explode. And so that's the issue. Capitalism's biggest strength has always been its adaptability. And when I'm talking about the death drive accelerationism of the current administration, they do think that with technological development and rapid economic growth, or at least one last round of it, prompted by incredible tax cuts and deregulation, that's going to be able to usher in the next round of adaptability, right? If we can get growth up enough, right, and maybe with AI and these promises of this technology really taking full form, that we could have unprecedented growth, right? That we could plow through this moment of crisis and reach a new round of adaptability for, these people are, Trump's almost fucking 80, Elon Musk is 50 or something. Like, they just need this system for their own self-interest to last a couple more decades. And that's kind of always been at the core of capitalism's adaptability. The economic and ruling class aren't looking to keep this thing going for hundreds of years. They just need to keep it going for their own portfolios and their retirement and their investment plans. And so that's the short-sightedness of it. And that's also what the accelerationism is trying to accomplish. One more round, but you're right. Those micro tears are adding up. And the post-war moment of U.S. hegemonic unipolarity, which it did rely on heavily to siphon resources and wealth back to the imperial core, to satiate, certain strata of the working and upper classes of the imperial core societies. When that unipolarity breaks down, when the third world continues to rise, right, and new forces come onto the scene, that's also an existential threat to its power and adaptability. And all of these things are happening at once. And so, yeah, we're kind of here to see what happens, and we got to be as organized as we can to take advantage of the opportunities that are going to be opened up and to be able to take care of ourselves when the crises inevitably erupt. And the very last point I want to make, and I'll hand it back over to you, is you made a point about monopolies. And that's a point that I always want to stress. Competitive free markets, this ideology that free markets are the way, like, deregulate and let markets compete and they will create the best products and the best prices. The irony of that is that competitive free markets always lead to monopolies. Somebody wins those competitive games and they amass more and more of the market share. And what happens when they're big and strong enough? They buy out competition, they corner the market, they infiltrate and corrupt politics, and they eliminate their own competition, leading to monopolies that are top-heavy, that suck up all the oxygen out of the economy, siphon all the wealth to themselves, and create stagnation and crisis in the economic system itself. This is the logic of capitalism playing itself out. And you're right, the fact that we have these nepotistic children of rich men who got handed life on a silver platter running this machine is just more indication that that's what's happening.
No, absolutely. I mean, the hard example was all right, but I think the rubber band was better. But I mean, I think right now America is completely humiliated, right? On a global scale. I mean, for God's sake, we sent Israel unlimited fucking weapons, right? Mm-hmm. We sent them everything. We gave them all the support you could. The entire brunt of the Western world against this 5-mile corridor, or just a couple miles corridor. I don't know the exact size of Gaza, but it's very small. Mm-hmm. Against a couple handful of guerrilla fighters in the Al-Qassam brigades, the entire brunt of the Western world against them, and they won. They humiliated the American empire. The Vietnamese people humiliated the American empire. The Afghani people, right? These peasant farmers against the world's strongest military. Humiliated the American empire, and Russia most recently And of course, I'm not a fan of Russia. I see it as much of a counter imperialist bloc, but it has also humiliated America. Whereas America, when the Ukraine-Russia war started, well, we were saying things like, "Oh, it'll be over in a couple months. It'll be over in a year." But America has come out of it with its tail in between its legs. What it speaks to right now, and what I think America's rulers' philosophy is really just, China's on the rise. China is the new world rising hegemon. We have lost a lot of our trade partners. We have lost a lot of our trade partners in Latin America, in Africa, in the Middle East, even Saudi Arabia most recently has been middling, right? It hasn't completely given up America, but that's our most reliable ally. And the fact that it's middling says something. That really does say something. The rise of China on one pole of the world, and also America's continual humiliating defeat, has led to the American ruling class thinking, first of all, the way to gain back American dominance is to just develop a weapon, right? Like, we just have to get this ultra super good weapon that will help dominate these people without actually understanding why wars win or lose, right? Guerrilla warfare relies on the popular support of the people and to, get the occupying force to break itself in terms of occupying the country, waste as many resources, things like that. And so as American capitalists right now are looking towards these startups like Palantir, which try to get all this data to help with weapons. They're trying to get these AI drones. They're trying to get back American dominance of the globe without understanding why America has lost dominance of the globe. And that is because socialist, communist, and even national liberatory movements are the organic will of the vast majority of humanity. What the world situation has been imposed onto the world before has been artificially imposed top down by America, right? Post-war, World War II. I mean, before that, it was the Europeans. But it's been posed top down artificially. It is an artificial move, a world order that has no mass base of support. The mass base of support is with the Maoists in India, the Maoists in the Philippines, the Al-Qassam brigades, all these national liberation movements. And so America is right now thinking, we just got to get a Palantir, right? We just got to get these AI drones. They've been obsessed, these ruling classes, with AI drones. We just got to get some supercomputer bullshit that will get us back domination of the globe without understanding why America lost domination of the globe in the first place. And that's because the people of the globe did not want you fucking there, and your own people wanted food in their mouths. Like, people at home needed food in their mouths, and all the finance monopoly capitalists could care about was their bank account, was reinvesting their capital into the military industrial sector as much as they could. So it's caused American dominance to break. In addition to that, the rise of China has just led to America losing all of its trading partners. And China itself is complicated. It claims to be communist. It has a highly regulated capital. Whether or not it is social imperialist or not, I've never been able to figure out, because the way that China acts is not like traditional empires, especially like, say, America, where will dominate a place. It'll build hospitals and railroads and, much more beneficial mutual trade, though it still is for the extraction of capital. So I always have a give or take on China. I cannot figure out where China is headed specifically. But the fact that America has lost all of its trading partners has led it to sort of forego the illusion of sovereignty for its closest trading allies, right? You saw right now, as of this recording, Trump bitch slapping Zelensky right in front of us. Before, America would act like, these are sovereign nations, right? But now we are just extorting for as much open imperialism as possible, for as much open extortion as possible, almost like a mafia boss, telling you that if you don't get the payment to tomorrow, you're going to get your kneecaps broken. We have essentially, in order to hold on to our allies, because we know that China is the new kid on the block, China is able to do innovation, capitalism, Chinese socialism with Chinese characteristics much better than America can. They've got a 6th-generation fighter jet. America spent $1 trillion and couldn't even get that jet to go through. It's not even functional. I mean, America has so many parasites now because of this over-bloated bureaucracy, because of this finance monopoly capitalist sector that's been siphoning off profits for itself, that it can't even function as an empire anymore. It's being forced to bitch slap all of its allies into just forcing them to be loyal and not go towards China.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And that's another way that it's shooting itself in the foot, as you were kind of alluding to. Not only is its ideological illusions falling, right? The Ukraine-Russia situation happening at the same time or overlapping with the Israeli-Palestine conflict blew open the illusion of American ideological messaging, right? And in one instance, we're for self-determination, we're for sovereignty, we're for respecting people's rights and borders, we're for international law. And in the other one, we are funding and protecting politically an absolute genocide. So the Palestinian struggle raises everybody's consciousness, these two things happening at once, forcing America to say the exact opposite thing in both circumstances, right? That just implodes that aspect. We already talked about Trump and Elon dismantling its soft power mechanisms, the NED, USAID, etc., weakening its ability to engage in clandestine subterfuge in various countries around the world. Its reputation has collapsed around the world, as you were saying, from the bottom up as well as across the international spectrum with regards to its allyship, because one of the worst and most dangerous things to be in the world right now is as a U.S. friend, right? Look at Canada, the way that Trump is treating even Canada, which is just like might as well be an appendage of America. It's so closely related, and that relationship is taken so for granted, and now there's tension there. Europe is feeling completely isolated and even attacked by J.D. Vance going over there, wagging his finger and condemning them. They're not taking NATO seriously, weakening that whole project as well. Europe is now talking about forming its own military, leaving NATO behind, taking care of itself. We can't rely on the U.S. And then even its pawn on the chessboard, Zelensky, is being humiliated in the White House on public television, yelled at by Trump and J.D. Vance at the same time, and being discarded as so many other U.S. proxies, to be clear, have been discarded in the past, but this one is with no ideological illusions, no ideological fog surrounding it. So this is a way that just everything about, and they're not doing it because, as you were saying earlier, because they're like, they want to destroy U.S. empire. They think they're strengthening it, and they are destroying it. So Xi doesn't have to take over Taiwan or make a quick move before the demographic situation gets out of control. He can just sit back, continue creating trade partners, continue using Chinese soft power and diplomacy, continue arguing at the UN that sovereignty is really important. We need to respect people's borders. China hasn't dropped a bomb on any other country. China hasn't invaded any other fucking country. China has now a moral superiority. It's on a genuine moral high horse and is now taking the role of the responsible rising superpower in the world that can work with and talk with anybody, and at the same time that the U.S. is self-immolating. And I thought it was kind of funny, as a complete aside, Bernie Sanders came out and wanted to chastise the Trump administration over the Zelensky thing, and he was talking about how sad it is that America is not supporting Ukrainian democracy. And I just wanted to point out, not only is Bernie Sanders an imperialist stooge and fully embedded within the Democratic Party and imperial apparatus of the U.S., there's no such thing as a Ukrainian democracy. Zelensky has, a couple years ago, 2022, banned all left-wing parties. All progressive, socialist, and communist parties are not allowed to vie for democratic power in Ukraine. Ukraine already was, just like Russia and the U.S., an oligarchy masquerading as a democracy. There was never any democracy there in the first place. And now Zelensky has suspended elections and is in power indefinitely going forward. We'll see how long that lasts now. But just the fact that Bernie Sanders comes out with this liberal imperialist bullshit, that what the Democrats have been doing is caring about democracy, much less caring about the Ukrainian people who are used as cannon fodder in their proxy war against Russia, that they helped exacerbate and create. Russia had come to the table many years ago saying, here's our red lines. If you just don't cross these red lines, we're not going to go to war. They did the 2014 Maidan coup. They were expanding NATO, very dismissive and arrogant towards Russia. Then Russia does what it said it was going to do the whole damn time. And then Bernie Sanders and others points to Russia and say, Russia started this war. Just like they point to Palestine and say, all of this started on October 7th. It doesn't work anymore. Their ideological apparatuses have failed. Their alliances are crumbling. Their imperial hegemonic unipolarity is coming to an absolute end. China is on the rise as a more responsible, trustworthy, and stable partner for more and more people around the world. And the U.S. is dying a violent death. The U.S. is not going out with a whimper. It's going out with a bang. We're just waiting to see what that bang is going to be.
Absolutely. And I think what China offers is less, it allows for you to have an actual national bourgeois as compared to like a completely comprador bourgeois where American global hegemony always relied on these compradors, William Ruto, Batista, Somoza, just these absolute compradors that would gut these countries. Whereas China is willing to work with all ideological various governments. And so if your government like Burkina Faso, which overthrew French colonialism and neocolonialism, if your government gets a national liberation movement, the first person to step in will be China, will be Russia, and they'll give your revolution aid because they do not care about really the ideology internally within your country, as long as you're good trading partners. I think that's why America is losing so badly. Imperialism has given all these countries within the global south all these tools to essentially liberate themselves. I mean, production has moved to all of these countries in the global south. The world has become more literate than ever, and that's not out of the goodness of capitalism. It's out of the goodness to create good workers. Mm-hmm. And as essentially the world has been given tools to at least divorce itself from Western imperialism by Western imperialism, and go towards not a necessarily socialist revolutionary character, but a nationalist, less comprador form of government. Mm-hmm. I also think there's a crisis right now happening where, when a Democrat or, a former Republican, like, a traditional Republican like Bush was talking to a foreign leader, it was the exact same relation that Trump and Vance had with Zelensky, right? They were basically, in more diplomatic language, saying, fuck you, you're basically our puppet, don't even talk back to us. But it was diplomatic, right? Mm-hmm. We'll have this wonderful trade agreement, and we're great friends as nations, and I love your sovereignty. And that for a lot of the workers within the global South that are liberals, right? That are labor aristocrats, mm-hmm. Better off in the majority of their working classes. They were able to fall for that, right? They were able to become Americanized, believe in the American ideology. There's always been a section of the global South. I think within American circles, we look at the global South as completely unified, right? It's all just workers. What we don't realize is within the global South, there's liberals that are labor aristocrats and love America and are subsumed within American global hegemonic ideology. There's of course the very, very exploited workers. There's the bourgeois of these countries and petty bourgeois, what have you. But these liberals that were comfortable and believed in Americanism, the even our European allies like the who owns Greenland? It's the Danes, right?
Danes, yeah.
Yeah. They were able to sort of fall for this sense that, oh yeah, we have our sovereignty. Oh yeah, America's a great partner. Oh yeah, this is a great system, and we're able to make our own trade deals, and these are our own trade deals, and in our best interest also, and not just America's interest. But as America rips off that mask and really shows that these governments have always been what they've always been, which is puppets, in order to maintain their grip on them and keep them from going towards China, I think even the liberal labor aristocrats have become a little bit radicalized against America. I mean, what Trump is doing, and I think within the internal logic of capitalism needs a Trump right now. But also, what it's not realizing is that it is destroying itself. I think that is just the ultimate. That is all I can really say about the system. Maybe he is a Chinese Asian and he's secretly a communist, and he pulls out his quotations by Chairman Mao after defunding U.S. aid, and he says, Mao, well, I'm doing it for you, Mao, something like that. But that's how I feel. About a world situation.
Yeah, no, it's dialectics at play. And I just wanted to mention, you mentioned Burkina Faso. There's the alliance of the Sahel states now, another blow against imperialist neocolonialism in Africa. So that's another signal of the global South standing up, kicking out compradors, kicking over neocolonial relations, forming economic and military unions and alliances, and doing it in the spirit of Thomas Sankara. It's a beautiful thing to see.
Absolutely. Moving on, you've talked to people all across the ideological spectrum, trots, anarchists, egoists, what have you. If there's an ideology, it's probably been on Revleft or your other shows. Are there any tendencies that you notice that is shared, is common amongst all these different ideologies that you found within all leftists and socialists?
That's an interesting question. What I find amongst, and that was much more, I've certainly had on, people of every different tendency, and that was kind of a thing I was doing early on with Revleft. Is it was in that exploratory phase where I was like, let's just have on a representative of every major tendency on the left, and let's hear them out, learn about them. We can disagree or whatever, but it's important that we actually hear from their mouths instead of somebody who already disagrees with them, what they actually believe. And, I've obviously kind of moved on from that, but I keep an open arms to people who want to come on in good faith discussions and have discussions, although now it's much more with a explicitly Marxist bent. But yeah, I guess the things that I find amongst people is, even if they're not as politically developed as maybe some others, there's always this sincere repulsion against inequality. There's this attempt in the spiritual desert of capitalism, alienation, to find meaning and even identity through political identification and to find purpose in joining with others to try to create a better world, which is a beautiful impulse in human beings. There's a split in every single tendency between the dogmatists and egoists of every single one. Like, it's very common for, an anarchist or something to say Marxists are all dogmatic or vice versa. But every single tendency has their dogmatist and their egoist and their antisocial narcissist because politics attracts, those sorts of people like flies across the political spectrum. And then they all also have their genuine, humble, willing to put in the work, continue to learn aspects as well. And so that obviously those are the elements that I want to highlight and play up, because I think that's important. And Marxism is, and revolution is, an open-ended, in some sense, experimental project that we have to engage in with humility. And if we are led by our egos, or we are reducing this thing to dogma, it just completely obliterates any potential that they might have and connects us or disconnects us from other people, etc. And yeah, there's just a genuine concern about the future and a widening consciousness outside of the confines of ideological conditioning that people are grappling with, and they grapple with it in different ways. I don't know if that's getting at the question. The question itself is kind of ambiguous to me, but let me know if you want to get drill down into details on some of that, or if I'm misinterpreting your question altogether.
No, not at all. That's exactly what I was looking for. One thing I've noticed is there's two kinds of tendencies within various leftist ideologies, and it's either a complete rejection. There's extremes, right? There's a complete rejection of dogma and pragmatism over dogma, to a point where you even lose like the original revolutionary character of the theory. There's like very extreme version of that. You could say like the MAGA communist movement or LaRoucheism or what have you. And then there's also the exact opposite, where you turn it into this unable to actually affect the real world, no concrete analysis of the real world. And it becomes instead like a catchphrase, right? this is state capitalism. There's no such thing as socialism. It's just state capitalism. You can't do socialism ever, right? Unless it's perfect. So let's not even try. It becomes defeatist in both ends. And I think the perfect encapsulation is a perfect blending of theory and practice, right? Theory and practice, and a theory always informed by our material reality around us. What is your criteria for somebody you would consider a comrade, right? Like across the ideological perspective spectrum? Because for me, it's always been, one, you're anti-capitalist, right? You're anti-American imperialism. You're willing to at least defend, socialist states against Western imperialism and regime change, and that you're just open-minded and genuine, right? That's always been my criteria. What would yours be for a comrade?
Yeah, just really quickly, I just want to address the point about theory and practice. Is that we all understand like too much theory and not enough practice. That's obviously a dead end. It's also, when you try to organize, you run in very quickly to organizations and people who have no theory, but they're organizing and maybe even doing good work. But the fact that they don't have theory, they don't have understanding, radically limits what they're able to do. So that gap goes in both directions, and that's why they need to be unified. But yeah, to your point about what is the basis for unity, I think there's different bases for different organizations. So if we're talking a vanguard party, we're talking an advanced organization of that sort, I think that a unity of all true Marxists need to happen. So a real Marxist is somebody who understands that, understands the basic critique of capitalism, understands that imperialism is capitalism on the global scene. Imperialism is what capitalism does in its most generalized global dimensions, and therefore it needs to be fought with the same rigor and with the same amount of energy that you would fight capitalism, because it is the same thing. And so that is crucial. And a lot of times you'll see people on the revolutionary left who aren't interested in confronting imperialism. They think that you can spontaneously have uprisings against capitalism at home, or you can use the democratic mechanisms of ostensibly democratic bourgeois society to advance socialism without thinking about counter-revolution, and not thinking in terms of internationalist connections, and that leads to a whole bunch of really shitty analysis when it comes to things like Palestine, when it comes to things like Syria, when it comes to things like North Korea, right? You can get incredibly chauvinistic, idealistic, reactionary, even out of ostensibly revolutionary anti-capitalists when it comes to that, precisely because of that lack of understanding. So if you're talking a vanguard party, I don't think, and I don't like MLs and MLMs thinking they can never work together. I think that's absurd. I think the differences there are important. I think it's important that we are clear about them and that we struggle about them. But thinking in the terms of like just an organization here in the U.S., if we ever got to a vanguard party level, there's no reason why true good faith Marxists that go through political education in the process of organizing and entering the party cannot use the mechanisms of democratic centralism and comradely struggle to work out our problems, identify primary contradictions, find non-antagonistic contradictions versus antagonistic ones, and work through that in good faith. But that does require some of the emotional and personal tools you laid out of, just being not a freak, not a weirdo, being able to work with other people, not having an insane ego, not always wanting to be right, not thinking you're coming here to teach everybody else, but you're actually coming in with an open mind, willing to learn, willing to struggle, willing to self-criticize, and willing to work for something bigger than yourself. But when we're talking about mass movements, we're talking about broader organizations, obviously the standard decreases a little bit, right? There's a role for united fronts against things like fascism. There's a role that bigger mass organizations play in funneling and educating people through experience into, more principled or advanced formations. And so for that, a broad understanding of capitalism, of the need for class solidarity, that class struggle is essential, that we share more with workers in other parts of the world than we do with the bourgeoisie of our own, that the two mechanisms of the ruling class, the two-party systems, are both hostile to our position, and they will they'll play the good cop, bad cop routine on us, but don't for a second think that we're going to get anything by appealing to or engaging with the Democratic Party as such, much less liquidating ourselves inside of it. Those are some of the even lower level standards that I would hold for when it comes to organizing. Because if even that standard, I understand the need for mass movements and mass organizations, but if you can't even make sense of those basic concepts, then your movement is just literally going nowhere whatsoever. And it's incredibly susceptible for just immediate co-optation by the Democratic Party, which is just a knife in the throat of any organization and any movement whatsoever. So those are kind of the two broad standards I would set for two different types of formations.
I think that's an excellent Leninist answer. I mean, any organization does need a very highly disciplined working class membership that is able to lead the workers, and especially if we allow in all these different various tendencies that are because, one of the biggest issues of leftism, Marxism, is that bourgeois ideas inevitably infiltrate leftist movements and spaces all the time. And they disguise themselves as truly liberatory or revolutionary, radical liberalism or social democracy or, even other Marxist tendencies that call themselves Marxist. I mean, this is what Leninism was born out of, that split in the Second International, right, with the Kerensky and the Second International becoming very heavily infiltrated by bourgeois ideas. I think one of the oddest phenomenons that is always so hard to tell about the left, and I've always been trying to figure it out, is why is the left so divided, right? And why is the right so easily united, right? The right will argue with itself, white supremacists will argue about who's truly white and who's the real master race in Europe or something, or who is the true Aryans. The conservatives and the neocons and the libertarians will argue, and the Democrats and Republicans will argue, liberalism, of course, being inherently right wing. But I think the issue is leftism, until it is actually able to do revolution, remains to some extent an ideal, right? Like, even if it is a scientific analysis, until that scientific analysis is practiced, you really don't know who has the best framework for actually getting the revolution done, who has the most excellent analyses of capitalism itself. Until it is practiced, Marxist-Leninism, MLM, Hoxhaism, what have you, all these tendencies. And so when you are not in power, when your main goal for right-wing ideologies, that is to preserve the current superstructure and base of society, and tweak it a little, right? Tweak it a little. Neocons will tweak it. Fascists will put it into emergency mode. Liberals will put it into a relaxed sort of empire driving. It's a very easy job to just defend the system, but to overthrow capitalism is a very tough job. And this inevitably leads to all this infighting, because you have to have the perfect analysis, the most scientific analysis for both the issues of capitalism and how to overthrow it. And this is where all of these different tendencies come in, right? Marxism, Marxist-Leninism, Hoxhaism, Maoism, what have you. But to some extent, you were laying down this point that, MLs, MLMs don't need to necessarily fight. I think you're exactly right. As important as the differences are, between Marxist-Leninism and Maoism, mass line and non-revisionism and what have you. What the fuck can we do about China, right? Like, exactly. These debates about, like, the fate of China is up to the Chinese people. What our party's position on China is in the long term does not really substantiate much on the ground within America. And of course, it is a worthwhile debate, but things like that so often divide the left, and it's because the left's job is monumentous. And sometimes these are genuine arguments about the structure of a party and how to overthrow capitalism, but sometimes they are, to some extent, useless. To some extent, they are petty. Why? I'll let you speak. I'm sorry. I'm talking over myself.
No, that's fine. Yeah, I think your points are all incredibly important, and that point about right reactionary formations reacting against social movements, reacting against developments and progressive movements, reacting against socialist movements, defending something that already exists despite disagreements on what the critique of the thing that already exists, etc. There's a broad agreement that we do not want this progressive movement, so it's not really about building something new. Conservatives and reactionaries are not fundamentally interested in building something new. They want to hearken back to something or defend something that's already existed through tradition, and that just allows for a sort of easier time, whereas you're right, the left is trying to build something totally new, and that is in the future, that's indeterminate, that is unconstrained, that's wide open, and therefore 1,000 different ways of thinking about and going about doing that open up. There's also an element, and you can see this with the Trump movement, how the right and it's not to say this never exists on the left, but to a much less extent, the right really enjoys falling back behind a leader. They like a strong man. They like a guy that they can project all their hopes onto and really get behind him and kind of subordinate themselves to it, right? For the right, always calling everybody cucks and making fun of everybody for being weak and, I'm a real man, I stand up for this machismo performance they put on. They're so willing to subordinate themselves to a great leader to take care of things for them and to actually be a proxy for their own, masculinist aspirations. And I think that is just like a weird thing that's certainly alien to me and alien to a lot of people on the left. We're interested in democratic communal movements, mass movements, coming together as people, working together to build something brand new. And so that's an element of it as well. But yeah, I think you put your finger on the gist of it, on the most substantial aspect of it, which I'm just kind of reiterating in a slightly different way.
Yeah, and also I think just going to that right point, the rights, when they fall behind a leader, it's safety, right? Like change is scary inherently, like especially people who are subsumed with thousands of years of tradition. I mean, private property has existed since agricultural societies. Woman and patriarchy can find its origins in the de-evolution of humanity out of primitive communism to class society. So when you have all these traditions behind you, something new and radical that changes that says, let's get rid of class society, let's get rid of patriarchy, let's get rid of homophobia. That is inherently a scary thing to ask, whereas safety is familiar. And for many right-wing people, their entire ideology is an ideology of fear, and not to reduce these very complex movements to very simple emotions, but it really is fear versus hope. I mean, that's what socialism in its best attributes proposes, that humanity can do better than this, and we believe in a future for humanity rather than this barbarism that they're giving us.
Absolutely, and yeah, that's a very human characteristic. We all have, to some extent, that contradiction between fear, comfort, stability, and experimentation, doing something new, growing. So that kind of is a human thing, and yeah, fear, I think you nailed it, is the if we're reducing movements to like base emotions, fear is a huge part of it. I would also add disgust when you get to the more reactionary elements as being a pronounced emotion that drives things, right? This need to purge out, impure elements. This goes back to Nazi impurity and the bloodline and all of this obsession about blood and soil. So fear and disgust, and then defending of long-standing traditions that already exist there. And you mentioned safety, which is a sort of salve to fear. That manifests as law and order, right? Stability. Anything that threatens stability, anything that is pushing for dramatic change, the reaction is violence of the state, the police, in the form of law and order, and they're always banging on about that, which is, I think, a reveal of their underlying fear that really does drive them. So yeah, I think that is obviously it's in some sense a reduction in a simplicity, but I also think it's a genuinely robust and substantive aspect of all reaction at the end of the day.
I think one thing that we often forget about is that all dictators, all right-wing movements, all fascists have had to have some popular support, right? It's not the majority of the society, right? It's a subsection of society.
Mm-hmm.
But, fascism's base was within those that were consumed with the most traditional aspects of society, right? Men, the churches, those who were afraid of the new, right? And so even in the most dictatorial fascist regimes, they have always relied on at least a small part of the masses that are afraid of change, that stand to lose something a little bit within the current system if there is change. And for example, let's take men. Men under socialism and communism tend to gain so much, right? Liberation from strict gender roles, the alienation of the workplace, just this, sense of being boxed into the social role. But also on the opposite side, within capitalist society, you get to be the king of your household. You get to dominate over your wife and kids. It's a fucked up way of you being your own little mini CEO within the house. And that's your job under capitalism, is to raise a good worker through how your kids view you and your relation with your wife and, your own kids. And what these little concessions that have been given to these traditional aspects of society make them afraid of that change, because they don't want to lose that tiniest bit of power that these very large superstructures have given them.
Yes, and there's an irony there too when you're defending capitalism and class society, because class society goes way back, capitalism less so. But capitalism actually overtly militates against tradition. It is a mechanism of rapid, there's this revolutionary technical aspect to capitalism where it's constantly overturning things, in this sort of blitzkrieg force ahead that is capitalism, that actually destroys the sort of provincial traditionalism that a lot of reactionaries and conservatives want to maintain. So that creates a little bit of a cognitive dissonance. But because capitalism is the thing that they were born into, and that comes before them, they defend it. And so I always thought that, that's always an interesting sort of tension that is alive and well within reactionaries in the capitalist epoch. But if you really want to understand reactionary psychology, I always find it very helpful to go back and study the reactionaries of the 18th and 19th and 17th century. They were defending monarchism and feudalism and the divine rights of kings against the revolutionary forces of republicanism and liberalism, right? So at that point in human history, that was the progressive force. And so conservatives, people that were fear-based, they wanted to run to the protection of, instead of a strongman leader, they wanted to run to the protection of the king. They wanted to maintain the king, the Leviathan, the sovereign. And so it's really to read their letters, to hear to read their sort of screeds and rants against modernity and development. It's just a fascinating peek into the reactionary mind that is put into different epochs and must react given that constraint, but really has this fundamental, just looking back over its shoulder, trying to stop progress, trying to stop change, always romanticizing the past. And as Marxists, we know that the only way out is through. The only way out is forward. There is no going back. That past never existed. Even if it did, it's totally dead. But I always find reading old reactionaries trying to defend monarchical and feudal structures from the revolutionary forces of capitalism and liberalism to be really, really insightful when it comes to the basic psychology of reaction.
Revolution will not happen until we have total Joe Rogan listener genocide. But really, I think you did hit the nail on the head that reaction is always behind. Like Mao said, it's the new being birthed out of the old, and the old tries to just maintain. But it's a dance, and it's a dance that always moves forward in some way or another. Mm-hmm. And the old is always the current new is always the future's old. To make it make sense.
Yeah.
We're getting late. Let's start wrapping this
Sure.
up. Just as a final sort of goodbye, and to end on a positive note, within America and around the globe, what are some movements, currents, things that give you hope, that keep you going? What drives you to have optimism?
Even aside from individual instantiations of movements and orgs, we mentioned Palestine, the Alliance of the Sahel States. We've mentioned the rising class and social consciousness of especially younger people, growing working class consciousness occurring, indigenous groups on the front lines of extractive capitalism and colonialism around the world, the waning U.S. Hegemonic unipolarity moment, already ending really. All these contradictions coming to a head. It's scary. But that is how change happens. That when you are alive at a time of great change, it is scary, it is overwhelming, it feels impossible. And you go back through history and you look at other people living through transformative times, and they have very similar sentiments. And the thing that always gives me optimism is a basic understanding of dialectics. That the more you ramp up repression, the more you ramp up its resistance. We talked earlier about imperialism going around the world, and through imperializing other nations and subjugating them and using hard and soft power, they educate the working classes of those societies. Go talk to an average Venezuelan about imperialism and talk to an average American about imperialism. Americans fancy themselves more developed. We're in a richer country. We live in a democracy, unlike Venezuelans, and they are just childish in their understanding of the world. And that's a dialectical response to being imperialized. Not only do you learn about it, you understand how the real world works. You don't have the luxury of retreating into fantasy and idealism. You also are taught how to resist it. And so dialectics gives me hope that there is always and everywhere a human refusal to be dominated and exploited forever. Fascism and fascist movements, they never last. Why? They can't, because they attempt to turn the dial of repression up to 10, which at the same time turns the dial of resistance up to 12. That's dialectics. Anywhere there's a boot on somebody's throat, there's a person grabbing that ankle and trying to stab into it with a knife. And so, change is scary. It's going to have many moments where it looks incredibly dark. No doubt, as members of the Imperial Corps, we are entering hard times. Things are going to get really bad. That's the importance of organization. That's the importance of networks of family, friends, and comrades that have each other's back. When shit really hits the fan, it's not money and guns and ammo that's going to keep your ass safe. It's having a community of people that love you and who you love that is going to be the actual social safety net in those times of chaos. And those are the people that are going to ground you, that are going to give you courage, that are going to keep you moving forward. So things are happening at the global scale. Things are happening at the national scale. Consciousness is being raised. Old illusions are falling apart. Masks are being ripped off of faces. And it's an exhilarating time. So instead of giving into despair, instead of giving into doomerism, instead of throwing your hands up and saying, oh God, we're all fucked, you have to realize this exhilaration is not the exhilaration of the end. This is the exhilaration of change. And we've wanted change. The worst fate is actually to be stuck in what we're living in now forever. That nothing ever changes, that nothing ever happens, that nothing ever gets overturned. That's actually the real hell. There's a comfort and a stability in that because we know that. We've lived in that for the last 40 years. But there's actual liberation in that coming to an end. And as it does, doorways that were closed our entire lives are going to be ripped open. Opportunities are going to present themselves again and again. And community, connection, and organization are going to be our best weapons in the undoubtedly hard times to come. And at the other end of this tumultuous time, at the other end of this transitionary period, whatever comes out the other end, it's going to be new, it's going to be different, and in some ways I truly believe it's going to be better. There are more people on this planet who have a material interest in a future for themselves and their families and the human species than the amount of people on this planet who have an interest in maintaining the brutal, disgusting, stupid, irrational fucking system that exists right now, because very few people actually benefit from it at the end of the day. And new ways of organizing human society around maximizing flourishing for human beings instead of maximizing profit for a few elite, that has to come. That is coming. And it might not be over the hill of this next crisis. It might be 2 hills. It might be the next. Who knows? We don't dictate, understand, or control the future, but we understand the past. We understand the present. We have the tools to navigate whatever comes. And community and organization gives us the resilience and the love and the connection to protect us during this tumultuous time. So I'm actually incredibly optimistic. I'm incredibly optimistic. If nothing was changing, then I would take the black pill. If nothing ever changed, I would be a doomer. But all there is inexorable, cascading change. And that's scary. It's also exhilarating. It's also creating amazing opportunities for us. So now more than ever, there's no apolitical life anymore. There's no turning and retreating into your personal life and saying politics is all messy. I don't want anything to do. Politics is knocking on your front fucking door. And how ready you are to answer it, how prepared you are, how many friends, family, and comrades you have standing behind you when that door flies open, that's what's going to be determinative of how you are going to make it through the next couple of years to decades. So yeah, I'm optimistic.
Absolutely. I mean, I think to some extent, there's been a little bit of escapism within like late stage neoliberal capitalism, such as like the rise of AI buddies and virtual reality. A lot of people have not wanted to confront what's happening right now. But I think, like you said, we have so much to be hopeful for. Revolutions have happened under the worst conditions possible. I mean, 100 times worse than even what we're facing for our American and Western European audiences. I mean, could you have imagined in the midst of the Vietnamese War, the Vietnam War, telling like a Vietnamese peasant that, yeah, we're going to win? It would have seemed impossible to do that the Vietnamese would have ever won, and yet they surmounted that challenge. In the October Revolution, it would have been impossible to have ever imagined. I mean, it's that quote. Socialism seems impossible, but so did the end of the age of absolute kings, right? It's always impossible to imagine the new happening until the new happens. And there's also this recognition that a lot of liberation fighters in the 60s had, Stokely Carmichael, Huey P. Newton, of revolutionary suicide. And that is not dying for a cause greater than you. This recognition that, yes, revolution may not happen in my lifetime, but I have 2 choices. And one is being subsumed in this sort of like overly internet language, black-pilled, doomerish sort of nothing's going to change and I'm just going to die in capitalism, or recognizing that the work that you do is a drop in the bucket towards that eventual liberation of mankind and humanity from class society, from capitalism, from racism, sexism, patriarchy, what have you. The Russian Revolution itself was built up on the foundations of past movements, past liberal revolutionaries. The Chinese Revolution, the very same. Every single revolution has stood on the shoulders of great giants and masses that struggled before them for that eventual climactic triumph. And nobody can say when that triumph happens. As we get closer to that triumph, as we get closer to that climax, shit is gonna get bad. It's gonna look bad. But like the Palestinian people who right now, in the midst of fucking rubble, in a landscape littered with the bones of their relatives, who have not even been able to get proper burial, who are still able to, through their faith, hang up decorations for Ramadan, still drink coffee and chat with their friends, still have hope for the future, still send their kids to school. I mean, these kids may have lost their uncles, their mothers, their fathers. They still refuse to give up amidst the worst destruction and Holocaust of the 21st century. Those kids, I saw the videos of those kids going to the school, and it brought a tear to my eye just how happy they seemed, just how excited they seemed. Talking to my Palestinian friends online, I think I have learned more about being a communist from Palestinians than I have some communists even. And I think our task and our fight that we have within American and Western society is not as hard as people who have done it successfully before.
Absolutely. Absolutely. If Palestinians, not only do they live their life, have their relationships, they continue to fight back. And Palestine has not only taught us how to be better communists, better liberationists, better anti-imperialists and anti-colonialists, they taught us to be better humans, fully human. And so the Palestinian people are at the forefront of this global fight and the inflection point of the best of humanity, and those trying to strangle and murder and kill Palestine represent the worst of us and represent the forces that all of humanity has to come together to finally put down and transcend. And I truly believe humanity can and will do it. And we have an obligation to each other and to the future to do whatever the fuck we can. And if Palestine can still rise up, fight back, live their lives, if you're sitting in the imperial core, you have no fucking excuse.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Breht O'Shea, thank you so much for coming on. This has been a wonderful conversation. I hope we can continue working together in the future. I like the way you think. I think we think very similar ways, but also a little bit different. I like picking your brain, basically. It's fun. Where can, if anybody doesn't know where they can find you, where can they best find you?
Sure. Yeah, I just want to say, first of all, the feeling is mutual. This has been really fun. You're incredibly insightful and incredibly funny. I would love to continue working with you and to just use my platform to get more people to become aware of yours. I think you have a really incredibly principled voice, and those are incredibly important at this time. As for me, you can find everything I do politically at revleftradio.com.
Okay, Breht. It's been a treat. It's been a hoot. You have a good one.
You too, my friend.
This episode of the Pokepreet Pod has been brought to you by our generous members on our Patreon. If you'd like to become one of them, go to patreon.com/thepokepreetpod. Thank you.
What the fuck? Glory to Stalin. I barely made it.
And a special shout out to our Marshal of the Soviet Union member, Matthias T. If you'd also like a shout out, please consider subscribing to our Patreon, where you can also get episodes up to a month early. Thank you.